When Frank pulled over on that dusty roadside, he thought he was just helping a tired old lady, but what she carried in that wooden crate would change the course of both their lives. The heat of that afternoon spread across the asphalt like a rough blanket. The road stretched ahead with no promises, flanked by dry fields and crooked fences that looked as tired as the hands that had once built them. The steady rumble of the freight truck was the only sound cutting through the silence of that land forgotten by time. Franklin Joseph Miller, or just Frank as he preferred, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with practiced ease. His fingers, stained with grease and sun, tapped lightly along to a song playing faintly on the old, nearly voiceless radio. It was one of those songs he no longer really heard, but still recognized, because it came from a time when things still smelled of fresh paint and morning coffee. That's when he saw her. In the incomplete shade of a lone tree standing on the dusty shoulder, a woman stood still. She wore a faded floral dress, a straw hat with a washed-out ribbon, and held a small, dark wooden box, maybe walnut, with both arms. The dress brushed her thin calves, and her shoes, worn and dull, were coated in dust. Frank slowed down without thinking. The truck groaned as it decelerated, its wheels kicking up a modest cloud of dust. The woman didn't raise a hand or signal in any way. She simply looked. The truck came to a stop beside her. Frank shut off the engine, pushed open the door, which creaked as it always did, and stepped out. He wiped his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief and approached slowly, like someone careful not to intrude. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked in a low, even voice. The woman nodded slightly. "Need a ride?" She hesitated, then answered with a calmness that felt rehearsed. "Just as far as this road goes, if it's no trouble." Frank shrugged as if he hadn't expected any other answer. "Hop in, just mind the box, the road's full of bumps." She nodded again, but before climbing in, she gently ran her hand across the lid of the box, as if asking permission. Then she entered the cab slowly, without hurry or sound. Frank returned to the driver's seat. The truck coughed as it started again, as if it too felt the weight of the new silence. The two of them drove on. For several minutes the only sounds were the engine and the wind rustling through the half-open window. The woman, Eleanor, as he would only learn later, kept the box on her lap, her fingers resting firmly on the polished wood. She stared out the window, as if searching for something that might no longer be there. Frank respected the silence, like someone who knows some stories aren't meant to be told right away. The truck rolled through open fields and past wooden poles that seemed to dance in the distance under the heat. A skinny dog crossed the road and vanished among the rocks. Outside, time moved slowly. Frank glanced sideways at the box. "Got something important in there?" he asked, more to break the silence than out of curiosity. She took a moment to answer. "Just promises," she said at last, with a voice made of cotton and weariness. Frank didn't push. He turned his eyes back to the road. The sun was beginning to lean westward, casting everything in a rust-colored gold. In that moment, between the hum of the engine and the sound of two lives barely intersecting, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a violin string being tuned in the distance. She wasn't just a woman asking for a ride, and he wasn't just a truck driver passing by. They didn't know it yet, but on that lonely, forgotten road, a simple gesture had just altered the course of two strangers' lives. The truck rolled along the bumpy roads, and the sun now filtered its last rays through thin clouds, painting the sky in an aged shade of orange. Inside the cab, time seemed to move more slowly, as if every second carried weight. Frank kept his eyes on the road, though every now and then he glanced at his passenger. She was there, as present as the steering wheel in his hands, and yet somehow far away, as if part of her still lingered in a place that no longer existed. The wooden box rested steadily on her lap, her hands folded over the lid, holding not just the object, but everything inside it. It was the kind of silence that didn't disturb. On the contrary, it carried a kind of quiet understanding, as if any word might disrupt what was already being said without sound. "You know," Frank said after a long pause, "some folks talk all the time and say nothing, and some don't say a word, but you still hear them just the same." She turned her head slightly in his direction, not smiling, but with a soft glimmer in her eyes. "That's because silence knows things words can't reach," she replied. The sentence lingered in the air like a vintage perfume. Frank didn't comment. He simply nodded. There was a calmness about her that disarmed him, and he, a man used to crossing states alone with only his thoughts and the hiss of the radio, suddenly felt like he wasn't just giving someone a ride. He was being carried too. Time passed in quiet fragments. Eleanor took a cloth handkerchief from her bag and gently dusted the box as if cleaning a family portrait. Frank glanced over. "That's some nice wood," he said casually. She ran the back of her hand across the lid. "Walnut. It was my father's. He used to keep his tools in it. After he passed, it stayed with me, and I started keeping other things inside." Frank didn't ask what was in it. Something in his gut told him it wasn't the right moment. Maybe it never would be. The road, he figured, would reveal what needed to be revealed. A bit later, they stopped at an old gas station with a glass and metal pump that looked frozen in time. Frank shut off the engine and stretched his shoulders. "I'm going to fill the tank and grab some coffee. Want anything?" She thought for a moment. "A glass of water would be nice, if it's not too much trouble." Frank nodded and stepped out. Eleanor stayed in the cab, watching the horizon through the passenger window. She saw a boy with a torn cap chasing a chubby dog. She smiled for the first time. While she waited, she carefully opened the box. Inside, tucked neatly among folded handkerchiefs, were bundles of old banknotes and a letter. She ran her fingers across the envelope, where it read in firm handwriting, "For whoever has the courage to stop." But she didn't open it. She simply closed the box again and placed her hands back on top, as if nothing had happened. Frank returned with a glass of water and a small bag with 2 sweet buns. "Coffee was weak," he said, handing her the cup, but these little buns looked honest enough. She accepted the water with a gentle nod. She didn't touch the bread, but thanked him nonetheless. Back on the road, night had begun to fall. The sky turned dark and the headlights cut through the darkness like old eyes well accustomed to it. And then, as if deciding to trust without needing proof, Eleanor spoke. "My children said I didn't need so much space anymore, or so many memories, that it was time to be practical." Frank didn't answer right away. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. "Sometimes, the ones who want less space are the ones who've forgotten what's worth keeping." She nodded. Night settled gently, and once again the engine was the only voice between them. But now something had shifted. It wasn't just the weight of the box anymore. It was the weight of what was being shared in silence, and of what, little by little, was becoming something like respect. The truck moved slowly down the now dark road, curving gently between hills barely visible in the headlight beams. The sky, once golden, had become a deep veil, scattered with just a few visible stars. Inside the cab, silence reigned. Only the deep hum of the engine filled the space, like an old road song humming low. Eleanor had settled into her seat, the box still resting on her lap as if it were part of her own body. But slowly, her eyes began to close, tired not just from the day, but from the weight of an entire life she had been carrying for decades. Frank, at the wheel, noticed her breathing slow. He didn't turn his head, but something in his face softened. The road demanded attention, but her gestures told another story, one he didn't know, but already felt part of. Then she murmured something softly, a loose sentence slipping between sleep and consciousness. "Albert, don't let the door slam." Frank kept his eyes on the road, but he heard, and held on to it. A few minutes later, another whisper, like someone speaking to someone long gone. "I said I'd take care of the house, and even alone." Then silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Not the silence of caution, but the silence of someone allowing themselves to dream, or perhaps to remember. Frank adjusted the rear-view mirror and peeked quietly. Her head rested lightly against the windowpane. The scarf covering part of her hair had slipped, revealing strands of white that shimmered under the pale moonlight. The box was still there, held tightly by her crossed arms, as if she feared that even in sleep someone might take it. He sighed, and for the first time since picking her up by the roadside, spoke without expecting a response. "Whoever you used to be, and whatever you're carrying in there, I hope you find what you're looking for." The road opened up into a straight stretch. In the distance, a few dim lights suggested a village, maybe a small stop, maybe just scattered houses with thick curtains and low radios playing old music. Frank eased the speed a little. There was no rush, not tonight. Passing a lonely house, he saw a swing hanging on the porch. It was still, but he imagined a child there, back when voices were louder and people still sat on porches to watch the evening pass. He thought of his own childhood, his mother sewing on the porch, his father arriving home sweaty from work, and the day he left, still young, convinced the world was bigger than the fences around his home. Now, nearly 50, it felt like the world had shrunk back inside, and real encounters like this one had become increasingly rare. As he turned his eyes back to the road, a possum crossed his path. Frank braked gently, not waking her, then resumed driving with the same steady calm. Everything about that night seemed to ask for care. For her, for the road, for whatever was still to come. A little further on, he pulled off to the shoulder. There wasn't a gas station nearby, but the road was quiet. He reached behind the seat for a blanket and gently laid it over Eleanor's shoulders. He didn't touch the box, or her hands. He sat back down and remained there, staring out at the sleeping night. He pulled out his small notebook, the one where he scribbled down thoughts and phrases while traveling alone. He opened to the last page and wrote, "Some people carry a name, others a story, and some a promise made to themselves." He closed the notebook, and for the first time in years he fell asleep too, even if only for a few minutes. Inside the cab, time seemed to stop, and out on the road, no one passed by. It was as if the world had paused, just so that moment could exist. Morning broke with a shy light filtering through the cracks of the truck's cabin window. The truck was still parked by the side of the road, and the silence of the night now gave way to the soft sound of birds and the breeze rustling the dry branches beyond the shoulder. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly. It took her a moment to remember where she was. She felt the blanket over her shoulders and adjusted the scarf on her head. The box, still in her arms, remained there like an extension of herself, steady but not heavy, as if it kept her alert, even in sleep. Frank was already up, standing outside, leaning against the side of the truck with a steaming aluminum mug in his hands. When he saw her stir, he opened the cab door gently and spoke in the same calm tone the morning carried. "Got some coffee, if you'd like." She gave a faint smile, nodded in thanks, and stepped down slowly, carrying the box. She sat on a stone near the front wheel, adjusting her skirt so it wouldn't touch the dirt. She accepted the mug he handed her. They drank their coffee in silence for a few minutes. The steam rose as if dancing, mingling with the cool morning air. Then, without lifting her eyes, Eleanor said, "I never thought I'd be riding these roads again. With a stranger." Frank gave a small smile but said nothing. She continued, her voice calm, almost like talking to someone she'd known for years. "My husband and I used to travel a lot when we were younger. He drove, I handled the luggage, and the food. We laughed at everything. He was good at fixing things, you know. Even made an old radio work once, using thread and a shirt button." Frank looked at her more closely. There was tenderness in her words, and a deep absence between each sentence. "After he passed," Eleanor said, eyes lowered, "the house just felt too big. The boys, they went on with their lives, their jobs, their families, and me. I became a burden." There was weight in her words, but she didn't cry. She said them like describing a season, inevitable, predictable, and still hard to accept. "They asked me to sell the house, said it was better for me, and for them too." Frank took a deep breath. He still didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to talking much on the road, especially about other people's lives. But something about this woman kept him listening, as if listening was part of some unspoken duty. She looked down at the box and ran her hand across the walnut lid. "In here is everything I managed to hold on to in a lifetime. Not just the money, you see. There are memories, promises, and one part I set aside for whoever offered me a gesture of humanity without asking for anything in return." She looked up and met Frank's eyes for a moment. It wasn't a desperate or pleading look. It was the gaze of someone who had lived long enough not to be surprised anymore. but who still believed that kindness was a form of justice. "There's a letter in there with your name on it. I wrote it last night." Frank felt a tightness in his chest, not from fear, but from not knowing what to do with that. A letter, with his name, written by a woman he barely knew, but who somehow felt like she'd known him in another life. "I don't want anything in return, Miss Eleanor," he said, calling her by name for the first time. She smiled softly. "I know. That's why." Just then the wind picked up, lifting a bit of the roadside dust. Both of them closed their eyes for a second, as if the universe had paused to say it had heard every word. She rose slowly, adjusted her dress, and climbed back into the cab. Frank followed, closing the door carefully. They returned to the road. But now it wasn't just a passenger and a driver in that truck. There was a shared story, and a dark wooden secret carrying far more than anyone could ever imagine. The truck's engine hummed like a tired but steady heart. The wheels rolled on through the winding road that cut between yellow plains, where houses were rare and human traces even rarer. It was as if the whole world had stepped aside, leaving only those two travelers to continue. Frank kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts wandered elsewhere. The silence between him and Eleanor had changed. Once it was the silence of strangers. Now it was the kind of silence that exists only between those who share something sacred, a memory or a sorrow. He glanced briefly at the walnut box. It sat at Eleanor's feet, still and solemn, as if even the truck itself showed it respect. With every passing mile, Frank felt her presence not as a burden, but as a mirror that reflected what he himself had been avoiding for years. "Do you have any children, Frank?" Her voice broke the silence gently, without intruding. He hesitated, then nodded. "One. But we hardly talk anymore." Eleanor slowly turned her head to look at him with warmth. Sometimes the silence between parents and children hurts more than any word ever could. Frank let out a quiet sigh. The road carried on, but inside him another one had started to unwind. It had been a long time since he'd spoken about his ex-wife, the quiet separation, the forgotten birthdays. Not out of bitterness, but because of accumulated distance. Sensing the heaviness in his eyes, Eleanor gently touched the scarf around her neck and said, "You know, when my youngest told me he couldn't look after me anymore because his wife thought the house was too small, I understood. I didn't accept it, but I understood." She looked out the window as if seeing her son, or a younger version of herself, somewhere beyond the horizon. "Sometimes we raise good people, but they grow so good they outgrow us, and too small to remember the road that brought them where they are." Frank said nothing, but something inside him opened. They passed an old abandoned gas station. The pumps were covered in tarps and the wooden sign hung crooked. Beside it, a rusty mailbox swayed in the wind. It reminded him of the farm where he'd grown up, his mother sitting on the porch, his father's big hands, a time when everything had felt permanent. He eased off the gas. The truck coasted down a gentle hill flanked by dry shrubs. Eleanor watched quietly until she murmured, "Frank, sometimes the road that matters most is the one we travel within." He looked at her, and for the first time smiled without restraint. A simple smile, the kind that comes when someone understands you without needing explanation. The sun had climbed higher, casting short shadows over the asphalt. Dust rose behind the truck in soft spirals. Then something unexpected caught both their eyes. In the distance, a small wooden bridge crossed a narrow stream. Beside it, a group of children fished with makeshift rods. One of them raised a hand and waved. Frank slowed the truck even more and gave two deep, friendly honks. The children smiled. Eleanor smiled too. "When my husband did that," she said, eyes glistening, "he used to say it was his way of reminding people they were seen." Frank didn't reply, but his throat tightened. They crossed the bridge slowly. Eleanor reached her arm out the window and let the wind brush her fingers. That simple gesture said more than any farewell. She was there, present, feeling, and Frank, without knowing how, felt a little less alone. A bit farther down, a rusty sign read, "Last stop before the crossing, roadside cafe." Frank checked the time, looked at Eleanor, and motioned with a glance if she wanted to stop. She nodded with a faint smile. They parked the truck under a twisted old tree. The sound of cicadas filled the air. Inside the small cafe, time seemed to stand still. An old jukebox played a soft instrumental tune, and the smell of apple pie mixed with fresh coffee. They sat side by side at the table near the window. Eleanor, watching the few people passing outside, said softly, "Funny how the road can change everything without changing anything on the outside." Frank looked at her. He knew now this trip wasn't just a favor. It was a chapter in his own life he hadn't known he needed to live. The jukebox whispered an old melody as Eleanor slowly stirred her coffee. The steam rose in fragile spirals, as if each turn revealed a piece of what she carried inside her chest. Frank had set his cap on the table, elbows resting, eyes fixed on her fingers. Fragile yet steady. He could feel something waiting to be said. He didn't ask. He just waited. "My husband was a woodworker," she began, her voice calm like a story she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. "He built that box with his own hands in the last few months of his life." Frank looked at her, then out the window at the truck, where the box still rested untouched. Eleanor continued. He was stubborn, knew his time was running out but kept working anyway, said good wood needed warm hands. "Cold hands are only good for measuring coffins," he used to say, and laugh at his own joke. She smiled too, bittersweet. When he finished it, he gave it to me and said, "Use this when you need to remember, or when you need to be free." Frank let out a nearly silent sigh. Her story was settling into him like the dust from the road. "So, what's inside?" he asked without raising his voice. Eleanor turned her gaze to the window, where a woman in a floral dress was sweeping the sidewalk. "Half of everything we ever saved together. Every coin counted, every bill hidden beneath the floorboards, every penny we didn't spend out of fear we'd need it tomorrow." Frank furrowed his brow, surprised. She nodded. "It's not a fortune because of how much it's worth. It's a fortune because it was built with silence and sacrifice." She touched the brooch pinned to her collar. "After he was gone, I got scared. Scared of growing old invisible. Scared the world would forget I'd been a wife, a mother, a person. But I made a promise. If one day I found myself alone on the road and someone truly saw me, half of whatever was in that box would be theirs." Frank sat motionless for a few seconds. The weight of what she'd just said didn't seem to fit in the narrow booth where they sat. He tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. "I don't need much, Frank," she went on, her voice steady. "I just need a place where someone calls me by my name, that's all." He was still hesitant. Part of him thought no one would ever offer so much for so little. Another part knew that this little was what the world lacked most, a human gesture with no strings attached. "You don't pull over for money," he muttered. "I know. That's exactly why." The doorbell jingled. A man stepped in with dust-covered boots and ordered 2 coffees to go. Frank checked the clock, as if reminded that time kept moving, even when the soul wanted to stay. "You want to get back on the road?" he asked, back to his usual practical tone. "We can have one more," she replied. The sky hasn't gotten tired of waiting yet. And so they stayed, a little longer, 2 travelers who had met at a crossroads between loneliness and meaning. Eleanor ordered a slice of peach pie to share. Frank didn't object. He knew instinctively that this too was part of the offering. When they stepped outside, the sun was leaning toward the horizon, turning the road signs a worn shade of gold. Frank opened the truck door for her, and she climbed in with a quiet sigh, like someone leaving a weight behind. "Mind telling me exactly where we're headed now?" he asked once they were back in the cab. Eleanor hesitated for a moment. "To the house of someone who's already forgotten me, but once called me a friend." Frank nodded. He started the engine, and the familiar vibration filled the cab. As the truck rolled back onto the road, she pulled a red ribbon from her bag and placed it on the dashboard between them. "It's not payment," she said with a soft smile. "It's to remind us that for a moment, 2 strangers mattered to each other." Frank gripped the wheel a little tighter. The road ahead seemed longer, but not as lonely. The road narrowed into silence, as if even the sounds had stepped back in reverence. The sky was dimming in shades of amber and lilac, and the shadows of trees stretched long across the wooden fences lining the dirt road. Frank drove slowly, eyes focused on the path ahead and on Eleanor's quiet presence beside him. She now held the walnut box in her lap. Her fingers gently stroked the wood, as if bidding it farewell. "It's just around that bend," she said, almost in a whisper. The house appeared like a memory, white with peeling paint and vines climbing up the porch. A rocking chair moved lazily in the breeze, and an old dog barked sleepily in the yard as they pulled up. Frank turned off the engine but didn't get out. He waited. Eleanor stepped down carefully, still holding the box firmly. She looked at the house like someone trying to remember if the past still lived there. The front door opened before she could climb the first step. Her woman, hair white and tied in a low bun, wearing a faded blue dress, stood in the doorway. Her eyes took a few seconds before widening in disbelief. "Ellie?" she said softly. "Ellie Whitmore." Eleanor smiled, her eyes already glistening. "Took me a while. But I came back, Anna." The two embraced in the middle of the porch. No words could have been stronger than that simple gesture. Anna reached up and touched her friend's face, as if to confirm she was real. Frank watched from a distance, unhurried. He took off his cap, rested it on the steering wheel, and waited. A few minutes later, Eleanor returned alone. Her steps were slow, but lighter now. She approached the truck door and asked, "Would you step down for a moment?" Frank got out. He rested one foot on the bumper and leaned against the truck in silence. Eleanor held the box out to him. "Inside this box is what I once called safety. But today, I don't need it anymore. I want you to have it." Frank took a step back, uneasy. "Ma'am, I really can't—" "Yes, you can," she interrupted gently. "You stopped for me when no one else would. You listened. You saw me as a person. That's worth more than anything inside this box." He looked at the box. Its varnish had faded, but its value was immeasurable. It held the weight of a lifetime. "I promised myself I'd give half of what I'd saved to someone who truly saw me. And you did." Frank nodded slowly, like someone accepting a mission. He took the box carefully and placed it in the cab. Before he could return, Eleanor stepped closer and tied a red ribbon around the side mirror. "Don't forget, all right? Sometimes a small gesture changes everything." Frank smiled faintly. "I don't forget easily, ma'am." She turned to leave, but paused on the first step of the porch. Looking back at him one last time, she said, "Thank you for not asking too much, and for knowing when to truly listen." Frank raised 2 fingers in a quiet salute and returned to the driver's seat. The house slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, but something from it would stay forever on the truck's dashboard, a red ribbon dancing in the wind, reminding him that kindness never gets lost on the road. The next morning arrived with a pale sun breaking through thin clouds. Frank's truck was already back on the road, crossing valleys and wooden bridges as if nothing had changed, except for one detail swaying in the breeze. The red ribbon, tied firmly to the side mirror, dancing in the wind. He wasn't the kind of man who kept trinkets or carried memories in plain sight. But that ribbon, it was different. It didn't speak of what he had done. It spoke of who he had been, even if just for a few hours. On the seat beside him, the walnut box remained closed. Frank hadn't touched anything inside. He didn't need to. He knew the true value wasn't in the bills stored within, but in the gesture it represented. The quiet recognition from a woman who had gone unheard for far too long. As he drove, he remembered the way Eleanor looked when she stepped down from the truck, the lightness in her steps, the embrace with her friend on the porch. And somewhere deep inside, something shifted, as if part of the weight he carried had been left behind on that veranda too. At a gas station stop, the attendant, a young man in a dirty cap with a quick smile, pointed to the ribbon on the mirror. "Some kind of superstition, sir?" Frank just smiled and replied with the calm of someone who'd understood something greater than words. "Just to remind me who I am, when I forget." Back at the White House with peeling paint, Eleanor sat on the porch with a cup of tea in her hands. Anna had prepared a room for her, with an old hand-stitched quilt on the bed. Next to it, a small table with a green-shaded lamp, and on top, the recipe notebook she'd kept since she was a young woman. In that new beginning, Eleanor found a peace that had long been denied, not because of luxury or silence, but because she'd found someone who remembered who she was. She was writing a letter, but this time not to keep. It was meant to be sent, with an address, a stamp, and everything. On the back of the envelope, she drew a small red ribbon and wrote beside it, "To those who know how to listen, even in silence." Frank kept moving. Deliveries, nights on the road, static-filled radio, bad gas station coffee. Everything as before. But every so often he'd run his finger along the red ribbon just to make sure it was still there. In the final scene, the truck crosses a wooden bridge with the sun setting behind the mountains. The ribbon sways gently, and the camera follows its reflection in the mirror as if to say, "You don't need the world to know what you've done. You only need to remember who you were when no one else was looking." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone who also believes that small gestures can change the course of a life. Tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone who made a difference, even in silence? And remember, sometimes what matters most isn't what we carry in our luggage, but what we leave behind in someone else's mirror.